Hello, I'm Rajneesh.
And I'm Bridget,
Welcome to Terra Science.
the podcast where reality matters.
I'm a plant scientist and I've been interested in combining old and new techniques to find solutions to the problems that we face of climate change, food nutrition, and how do we get these technologies to people. So I've been trying to work on that with wonderful guests that we have on this podcast.
And I'm a graduate student and a former vertical farmer, and I'm very interested in public communication and education surrounding food systems.
And today we have Dr. Abhimanyu Sarkar from UK. He is at the National Institute of Agricultural Botany at Cambridge and has a joint appointment with the University of Cambridge. It's a pleasure to have Abhimanyu Sarkar here because I've known him since fifth grade. We went to St. Xavier's School in Delhi together, and we started together in fifth grade. And we've been in touch and been to many places at the same time throughout our career. So, Abhi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you
Would you
very
like
much.
to share something about yourself?
Thank you very much, Rajneesh. Yes, it's indeed been a very long time since we sort of met. I think the last time we met was in 2015 back in India. But
Yeah,
we did go to school together. And then we met again when we were doing our PhD. And your lab, Dr. John Watson, at the University of
that's right.
Maryland was the first lab that I rotated through, and I was very
That's right.
pleasantly
Yeah,
surprised to meet you there. Uh, but eventually, I did not work on plants for my PhD. I worked on developing DNA transposable elements for gene vectors in insects, specifically flies, and worked for quite a while on mosquitoes and other flies. And mosquito is a fly, uh, other flies that have economic importance. But eventually, around 13 years ago, I switched back to plant sciences. Uh, and my training, my in bachelor's was in agriculture. So it was great to go back to researching plants, and I started working on legumes, specifically a forage legume called Trifolium or clover, as it's known, commonly known, which progr- which underpins New Zealand's economy of uh, pastoral agriculture, so feeding sheep and cattle. And From there, I moved to the UK in 2015, working on this very hardy but under researched legume called grass pea or Lathyrus sativus, which is very interesting because here was a legume that farmers grew, even though it was often banned for cultivation because it contained a neurotoxin called beta odap. Uh, in its seed and pretty much all its aerial parts, and could cause paralysis or neurolathyrism if it was consumed for a prolonged period of time as the sole source of nutrition. Now, you might think that why would anybody consume a legume as a sole source of food? Well, the reason is that this legume was so hardy that this was probably the only crop that would keep growing if there was a drought or famine, and people were forced to consume it in order to survive, even though they knew, and this is quite well known even in ancient times, that this would eventually lead to paralysis. So here was a catch 22 situation, um, and but people had to make that choice. One of the aims of our project was to actually make this legume safe for human consumption
Mhm.
by eliminating this molecule, beta ODAP, from grass pea. Now, we were not the first to try, and when we sort of went and studied the biochemistry in great big detail, we began to understand why that was very complex, because this molecule was being made by not just a single pathway, but sort of a complex pathway because of various biological reasons that I won't get into. But the main thing was that it varieties of grass peas had been bred that were very low in ODAP, but would never zero. You could never get to zero. So one of the
Mm.
things that we thought was to look at the genetics of the biosynthesis of this molecule and knock out those genes or mutate those genes to enable us to stop production of beta ODAP or ODAP and make it safe for human consumption. We wanted to take an approach where we didn't rely on any technologies such as genetic modification that would be a barrier to its adoption later on by farmers. So we, as scientists, were not philosophically against genetic modification uh, at that time, or are not against gene editing or genetic modification. We just found that technologies or those technologies were too expensive and complex, and also uh, lacked consumer acceptance. So we wanted
Mm.
to use a technology which would allow us to develop grass pea varieties fairly quickly, that would be cheap to develop, and that would be accepted by consumers and farmers in third world countries who typically grew grass pea, often as a last resort when their main crops failed. So that is something that was a sort of a basic premise underlying our project. So we chose to use a technology called tilling, which stands for targeting induced lesions in sorry, targeting targeting induced local lesions in genomes. And uh, the way that technology works is that we use a chemical mutagenesis to induce mutations in a species, and then select by molecular biological means those mutations in the gene of interest that give a favorable phenotype or a favorable character to the plant species that we are working with. And we performed this series of mutagenesis experiments with grass pea, and our lab um, identified mutants that were very low in beta ODAP, and these are serving as a basis to develop new varieties for third world farmers.
Wow.
Right. So
And
just to sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the main reason that grass pea is being focused on is because it has high protein content, right?
So there are quite a few things actually, and thank you for mentioning that. Grass pea not only has a high protein content, you could get grass pea varieties or even grass pea accessions, germplasm that are more than 30% protein in its seed on a dry
Mm.
weight basis. But also, grass pea is a very hardy plant. So you could
Right.
actually grow grass pea if there is a drought. You could grow grass pea if there is a flood. You can grow grass pea in saline soils. You can
Hmm.
grow grass pea when there's high heat. So basically, grass pea, even though it's grown in the cool season in the Indian subcontinent, for example, just like you would grow pea or which to which it is related, or lentil. It is very hardy, and it
Hmm.
also as a legume enriches the soil by fixing nitrogen. So
Right.
for a great number of reasons, grass pea is a crop of choice for many farmers who live on the margins and cannot afford for a crop to fail, because it's not that they will
Right.
not get money, not get money by not being able to sell their crop, but they will actually die by starving. So
Right.
Right.
it's
And it
that
and it
sort of,
is one of the 29 priority crops that have been looked at for climate change purposes and
Mm,
because they're hardier. I just wanted to quickly make a point about tilling that you were telling us about, Abhi.
yeah,
The chemical induced mutagenesis that the tilling utilizes, that chemical is only applied once. It's
yeah,
not so once the mutation occurs, like you were saying, by molecular means,
yeah,
that mutation is carried on to next generations. So the varieties that you're producing have no chemical treatments. The
no,
tilling is just a process to get the mutation. Right.
yeah.
and with that,
So,
is it still does it have any effect on the hardiness of the plant when you're going
No,
through the different mutations?
no, we actually have done studies, and it doesn't affect disease resistance of
Great.
some of the diseases that we have actually tested. It does
Hmm.
not affect tolerance to insects. It doesn't make it, for example, more susceptible to aphids, which is a pest of
Right.
grass pea. And it definitely does not affect hardiness for most of the conditions that we have tested,
Yeah.
including drought tolerance as well as flooding.
that's great, and clearly it is a good source of protein and is hardy, and it's a reliable plant. And times when times are tough, so there are many other areas of or sources of protein that people are looking at. The alternative sources of protein. To name a few, like insects, people are using insects and making powder, and that is being used in industry as well, and some people are also eating insects. Also, there is all this plant-based meat, so protein from like heme and hemoglobin. Companies have been utilizing that to make plant plant-based protein taste and feel more like meat. So, what do you think? Where do all these different sources of protein lie, and where should we be focusing on our energies more?
So there are a large number of alternate protein sources that are currently being looked into apart from plants, because uh, the land to cultivate plants is becoming limiting, and also fertilizer crops costs. Sorry, costs are rising. But there is always a limitation when we look at some of the other sources of protein. Many of these proteins depend on a fermentation technology or aseptic cell culture technology. For
Right.
example, lab based meat requires aseptic cell culture. Uh, a lot of the alternate proteins that you get in the market are based on fungal proteins, for example, corn,
Hmm.
and other sources from microbes or uh, basically single cell proteins. And these require a large initial investment, as well as aseptic growing conditions, and they also require a large input of energy.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
plants don't Plants get their energy, the primary source of plants energy is the sunlight, so that is free. uh, so plants have that advantage. uh, One advantage that other sources of alternate proteins can have is their ability to utilize waste products. For example,
Mm.
insect proteins uh, derived from insects such as the black soldier fly and the mealworm. They basically utilize waste streams from agriculture or other processes, such as household waste, and these are then sort of converted into proteins that can be used, if not by the humans at the first instance because of regulatory reasons,
Right.
definitely by the poultry industry or the aquaculture industry or other livestock for example, the monogastrics such as pigs. Um, so it is those technologies or those sources have their importance in their ability to circularize the uh, sort of the agriculture waste streams and close the circle in terms of utilizing them and converting them back into useful forms such as proteins. Um,
Right. So I guess I'm curious, in your opinion, is there a big difference between where you get your protein from, if say straight from plants, or is it, equivalent if you're getting it from alternative sources such as, say fake meat or even just meat itself?
uh, Yes and no. So it's not. So first of all, in terms of biochemistry, probably not so much, but
Hmm.
there is also I'm not a sort of a food science specialist or a human nutrition specialist, but all I can say that the food matrix does affect the ability of human beings to digest, um, uh, extract and digest the amino acids, and that does make a bit of a difference. But at the end of the day, not so much, but there are many cultural reasons why we still prefer plant proteins. That is one. The other thing is that some of the sources of alternate proteins, such as the single cell proteins, so the nuclear material or the DNA, there are purines which are not very well tolerated by human beings in many instances and can cause problems such as gout or damage the kidney. So that is those problems until they are solved in terms of uh, removing the DNA very efficiently from the single cell proteins, they will be of limited utility. Um, the other way to answer your question is that uh, it's not just uh, it's not just when you consume a we don't just consume proteins or carbohydrates alone. We consume them as a part of a mix of other nutrients. And
Right.
it is essential that whatever food that we consume has that balance of nutrients. So
Hmm.
while we may foresee a future where foods will be formulated for humans that have all the nutrients in the proportion that is required by the human body in a form that is easily digested and sort of absorbed by the human gut. Uh, it is that future is not yet here. So food scientists are, I guess, working on that problem. But insofar as us plant scientists are concerned, we are looking at uh, sort of increasing yield of high protein plants such as legumes uh, in environments which are sometimes constrained. What crop scientists are trying to do is uh, develop plant varieties that are high in protein and can be grown in a sustainable manner in the face of climate change. And I think that's one of the
Hmm.
more challenging areas that we as
So another
yeah.
thing I will add is the cost of production. I think, like you were saying, not just in terms of financial cost of producing single cell or other alternative like the plant-based meats, but also energy costs as well that go into it. So when you're going back to plant-based protein source, you're like Avi was saying, you're using sunlight and it's free, and also it has all these other benefits that come with it as a complete food source.
Hmm.
So looking into the future, I think it's important that we start paying attention to these other especially the ones that have been around and hardy plants, and people have been consuming them from even BC time, and so they're ancient. and sure they have these ODAP and some of these issues, which is why Abhi and his team are working to reduce that and make them more available. The next question, though, is is the reality part. So we have all these different methods of proteins, insects, plant-based meat, all of these things. And like Abhi, you were saying that the plant scientists are trying to identify sources of high protein, increasing protein, let's say in legumes. The issue is that our dependence on food, especially in the western part, is largely on processed food. So once you have high protein plants, they ultimately go straight back into the pipeline, and then who knows what happens? Then it's a black box. So ultimately, how do we actually cause an impact, real impact, to the consumer?
Okay, so first of all, as a caveat, a substantial proportion of legumes do go back into the food chain, human food chain, as animal feed, and
Right.
that's quite well known, especially something like soya bean. Uh,
Yeah.
but there has been a shift, or there is a ongoing shift in the food habits of people, where they're moving away from animal sources and uh, returning to sort of more plant-based uh, food sources, so cutting out meat and going for plant-based protein sources. And therein, I guess, lies the challenge of not only developing varieties. For example, you mentioned grass pea, but also for other pulse crops that are traditionally grown
Hmm.
in many parts of the world. For example, cowpea in Africa, and
Hmm.
a huge range of pulses such as chickpea, lentil, and the Vigna species mung and urd, as well as pigeon pea in India, and for example, soybean in China. It was a traditional crop there. And lupins, for example, in South America and Northern Europe, uh, as well as phaseolus, which comes from the Americas, the Central and the South Americas,
Hmm.
but is now very widespread uh, throughout the world. So basically, we are developing varieties that are appropriate not only for large scale mechanized farming, but also for small scale farmers. And one of the challenges in developing legume crops is not so much just increasing the protein content as well as the yield content, as well as the yield, but also ensuring yield stability by conferring resistance to various diseases that
Hmm.
cause an impact, a negative impact on uh, crop yields. So basically, the main limiting factor for wider adoption of pulse crops is not their yield, uh, but their susceptibility to various diseases and insect pests.
Mm.
And we are working to overcome that by breeding. And one of the ways we do that is to look at wild relatives of crops, uh, and identify sources of disease resistance in these wild relatives of the crop species, and then breed the resistance genes into the crop species by interspecific hybridization, or even, for example, by genetic modification by GM, or by gene editing. So these new technologies are coming into play in those aspects of crop improvement.
Just to add the point there, we are both plant scientists, and I know the GM and genetic modification, the connotations of these. It's not like that one is for or against.
Yeah.
I think we need to start thinking about what we mean by genetic modification.
Mhm.
Genetic modification actually goes all the way back to the caveman, as because by selecting for traits, by selecting corn plants with certain traits, we are modifying the crop or domesticating the crop, and that is also genetic modification.
Mhm.
So genetic modification doesn't always mean genetic engineering,
Yeah,
Right.
which is what we so just to distinguish, because a lot of the work that you're doing is being done through breeding,
yeah.
and that is less invasive, let's say. But so the other question then is how, so all these efforts, so you make the varieties, and now you have these seeds that are so valuable. How do those seeds then get into the hands of the farmers?
Okay, so there are a few different models that are employed. One of the things that we have done so far is not gone into the actual breeding part of it, but sort of develop what we call advanced pre-breeding material, where we uh, sort of develop prototype plants or or crop material that can be that have the traits that are required by the farmers in that particular crop species, and then we give that material to either breeding companies or uh, uh, public institutions in, for example, in the third world countries, and these national, what we call NARS, or the National Agriculture Research institutions, they actually carry out the breeding activities, and then eventually sell the seeds that they develop to the farmers. And when
Uh,
we partner with the national agriculture research institutions in various countries, uh, they actually give these seeds at a subsidized price to the farmers, allowing them to adopt that quite um, economically. Um, the breeding companies, again, they serve a very valuable role in terms of developing novel varieties for farmers and selling it, uh, making the research available to the farmers. Now, while they do make a profit, this profit that comes to come a portion of it, sorry, a portion of it which comes back to us, actually goes back to further research. So whatever, for example, comes back to NIAB in terms of royalties, we then actually plow it back into research. So overall, the farmer benefits by getting the fruits of the research through various channels, depending on their economic situation. Um,
Mhm.
uh, First world farmers typically get it from big companies who invest a lot of money developing the varieties, while a lot of the third world farmers, they depend on the national agriculture research institutions of that particular country.
Excellent.
yeah, that's great. So in terms of getting to farmers is one step, and then I think awareness, consumer awareness, is the other thing, to make people aware of these other sources. And like you were saying, people are switching more towards plant-based food and becoming more health conscious. So I think everyone has their own diets, but making some of these other alternative protein sources more available, and increasing awareness of consumers is what now we are trying to do through these media. So I think as we move forward, it'll be important to learn more and more about what these other sources are and what
Mhm.
research is going on, and how and where they can be grown, and how they can actually get on the plate for people to enjoy.
If you don't mind me sharing, we so there was recently we conducted a workshop very recently where one of the things that we sort of gained an insight was that Uh, so human beings, people are quite sort of fixed in their food habits. So, for example, if you ask me to have a meal with insect protein, um, I probably would not be thrilled, very frankly speaking.
I won't either.
Uh,
Same.
Right.
Simply because I have
Yeah.
not grown up
Right.
eating insects, and to me, both culturally as well as sort of psychologically, there is a barrier to eating insects as a source of protein. However, what was realized recently that if these alternate proteins are incorporated or in the diets of young children, along with educating them about the benefits, um,
Hmm.
or alternately, sort of educating them about the benefits of trying alternate proteins, then there would be an increased acceptance in society as this young people's cohort uh, grew up. So that would increase acceptance of using some of these alternate proteins, such as insect-based proteins, in the human diet. So human diet evolves fairly slowly through the generations. It's not something that you can change overnight. Um, so that's an observation that as plant scientists often overlook. We tend to narrowly focus on our own specialization and sort of look at a quote unquote a very logical solution, which is actually uh, not really applicable in human society,
Right.
Mhm.
because
Yes.
human beings are real. While we can
Yep.
build a theoretical model of what should be,
Mhm.
it's something that we need to translate that in the real
I,
world.
I'm so glad you said that. I have lots of colleagues, and we all have to write grants. And when we are doing basic research, we mention we are working on this gene, and this is the future of food. Because in the grants we have to link it to some application, and just those few paragraphs at the end are so commonly written. But I don't think and much thought goes into any of these other aspects, or the reality of actually how any of that work can really be translated. So I think we need to become more real about that, and think more about if you're really doing it for basic research, then basic research itself is very important. But if you're doing it for application, then we need to think a little bit more about that more deeply.
Yeah,
Also, something that you said, sorry,
yeah,
just about like educating. I think as the consumer perspective on this, I see trends all of the time about, this is the next best thing. This is, where
yeah,
you should be getting your protein from. And I think there's a lot of both misinformation and just confusion. So that's just like the other half of the challenge is,
yeah.
who do we believe? Who do we, go through to learn this, and who should be sharing this education? Is it a cultural thing? Is it, something that, like, who enforces what standard of education is, being taught and stuff? Yeah.
So that's very interesting observation. And in the defense of us as scientists, we are
Hmm.
uh, looking for more social science support in terms of what we do and how we
Hmm.
translate what we are doing from the lab to the real world.
Right.
And we have realized that it is essential that uh, we have to overcome cultural and psychological hurdles, as well as educating people. So
Hmm.
just knowledge does not always translate into action.
Hmm.
And otherwise we wouldn't have scientists who have high blood pressure or have high blood sugar. And yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, if diets were so easy to adapt, then a lot of the human
Right.
health problems would be very quickly solved. But yeah, there's quite a bit of resistance, psychological and personal resistance to
Hmm.
um,
And
making
just
changes.
the merging of those two worlds, where the whole online realm of needing to market your research or your findings up against all of the other,
Mhm.
you know, people who pay millions of dollars to get their impossible burger as this is,
Yeah.
what you should be eating and this is what's best. It's very hard to compete, you know, for the attention of consumers to not only believe that you have good research and good, knowledge, but also that it's something that they should care about in the first place too. Yeah, I totally agree.
And that's the challenge. So even after the farmer gets these wonderful varieties and they're
Hmm.
climate hardy and they can be
Right.
grown anywhere, they will only grow it if somebody is consuming them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so so yeah, those are, and this is why it's so wonderful to have you and explain all this to us here on this podcast. To really get deeper into the issues as well as the solutions
Hmm.
uh, for climate change that we are going to be facing, and food. So one question, Avi, that I always am asked when I meet people who are maybe not plant scientists. So in almost everywhere we write, we always say, well, there are going to be 8 billion people on the planet, and we'll run out of land, we'll run out of water, and soils are degrading, and we won't be able to produce enough food to feed all these 8 billion people. So, what do you think about that? And these kinds of alternatives, hardy plants, can play a big role in this aspect.
Yes, I agree. So by 2050, I think we are going to be nearer to 10 billion. So I think the goal is to feed
Yeah,
10 billion people.
right.
And
Yeah.
Wow.
a lot of the increase, in fact, Africa is going to double its population, add around a billion more people by 2050. And therein lies a challenge. Cropland in Africa is again limiting, and overall in the world, it's not calories that are limiting or calorie sources that are limiting, it's the protein sources. Uh,
Hmm.
and so we really have to solve the problem of having protein crops or protein sources uh, that can be produced in sort of a limiting or limited amounts of land that are actually reducing, unless you want to go for deforestation, which will just increase the climate change problems. And even that is happening, but again, there is a sort of, it's going to hit a point where you cannot cut down more forests to grow more crops. So we have to increase the per area yield of crops, especially protein crops, pulses, and
Hmm.
also look at pulses that are adapted for particular agroclimatic zones, uh, so that they are very efficient. So, in the lot of cases where a developing country develops its agricultural capacity, uh, crops that are foreign to its agroclimatic zone and soil, as well as cultural norms, are grown, while eventually they may become a part of that country's diet. The crop itself never really adapts very well to agriculture there.
Hmm.
So the country still depends on either imported food or cannot grow enough food using those particular crop species. So I think there is a challenge of not only identifying crop species that are locally adapted, but
Hmm.
also
Mhm.
improving those crop species that the farmers in that particular country grew traditionally. So they have identified and adapted crop species that will provide them protein and calories. but it's
Right.
up to us agriculture scientists to invest in improving
So,
Right.
those
yeah,
niche
that's
species.
actually super interesting. Maybe that's partly what needs to be one of the main focuses now for educating like local areas to be more interested in the local varieties
Yeah,
that are easier access than transporting food and the consequences that come along with transporting food, and really just focus on that local um, exchange of goods more so than we have been.
yeah, yeah. And as we see, I mean, stepping outside science for a bit, as we see, globalization is kind of hitting its limits now that
Mm,
we have had the pandemic and also the
right.
war. So also a lot of the fertilizer sources. So plants require three major nutrients or macronutrients to grow the nitrogen, which while we get from the atmosphere is dependent on fossil fuel for their production, and that's again limiting and will eventually run out. The other two nutrients, calcium, the other two nutrients, one of them is potassium,
Phosphorus.
and that again the sources and the global trade are Ukraine and Russia, the former Soviet Union. So that's an issue. And again, phosphorus, the third macronutrient, those that is also limited because it's mined in a few countries, such as Morocco and China and Russia. So again, those are limiting, and world agriculture is going to face issues sourcing them easily in the future. So
Mm,
we need to again develop plant varieties that are more efficient in extracting and utilizing these macronutrients from
Mhm.
the soil. And
right.
also maybe we should look into growing more legumes in crop rotations because they have the ability to fix nitrogen from the
Right.
atmosphere.
Yeah, so Abhi, we are working on some of those things in terms of information. We are working on some technology that will help hopefully allow local consumers to see what is being grown around, and hopefully encourage more of such hardier crops with better protein be grown locally and accessing them directly. So it's work that's in progress, and I think that when we look at all the problems, and I think the solution is actually not too hard. It is simple. It's to make our food sourcing more local and
Absolutely.
growing food in a much more responsible way
Hmm.
to not destroy the soil.
Right.
Uh, you know.
And I also would add to that a bit more seasonality.
Hmm.
We
Right.
actually expect a lot of foods year round, which are often grown and
Yeah.
shipped around the world.
Right.
But growing up, at least back in India, both Rajneesh and I, we remember we used to sort of could mark the passage of the seasons by the fruits that we would get. For
Yes.
example,
Yes.
Hmm.
yeah, summer was always associated with mangoes, and uh, we growing up in Delhi, we could actually sort of again mark the passage of spring and summer by the different varieties of mangoes that would be available at different
Oh,
Yes.
wow. Yeah.
months. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
there were mangoes
Interesting.
that you would squeeze. There were these sipping mangoes that you could
yeah,
squeeze at the bottom, and the juice would come out, and
yeah,
you
Wow.
just sip the
yeah.
mango. Um,
So,
yeah, and the taste, I think flavor also goes with that, because the longer time food spends in shipments,
Hmm.
I think it does compromise flavor, taste, and probably some nutritional value as well, but we don't know for sure. More research is needed there.
yeah, so one of the things is that again in fruit breeding, I think, and I'm not sure I should say this or maybe you can edit this out, but in fruit breeding, oftentimes uh, the ability of a variety to keep for uh, shipment has become more important than the original taste and flavor profile.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So
Yep.
basically, we have bred varieties that just are easy to ship, have a long shelf life.
Right.
Whereas previously you used to have varieties that had a very complex flavor profile but did not keep
Right.
or could not be shipped easily.
Hmm.
So those varieties have fallen out of favor from the food food chain, simply because the supermarkets cannot really stock them efficiently.
Right.
Or
I mean,
Yeah.
our problems are that we have centralized our food production in like big farms, and then everything has to go from there outward everywhere else. I think we need to decentralize, more seasonalize, uh, and more localize,
Yeah.
you know, all those things to save the planet.
but thank you.
Yes.
This is
Yeah.
my first podcast ever.
Awesome.
I don't
Wow.
think I've listened to too many either, to be very frank. But yeah, but
Well,
definitely the first
like and subscribe to ours. Yeah.
one. Okay.
Yes.
Like and
Yeah.
subscribe to ours.
So
Thank you. Yeah.
is it through like through YouTube?
We do YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and
Right. Yeah.
Google. So you can find it a bunch of places. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
We also have a website, so
Hmm.
you can find them all linked there. It's called
Okay.
terrascience.com.
Hmm.
Okay.
Just for all of our listeners, thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. Please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And we'll see you in the next one.